This is a bit off the cuff today. I just wanted to talk a bit about what I guess you could call meditation psychosis. This is not a real medical term. I'm not a psychologist or a doctor. This is not medical advice. I'm just talking about it because I've had a handful of experiences with it in my life. And in particular, I had an experience with it today. So I wanted to discuss this while it's still kind of fresh on my mind. So just for a little bit of background, for more than a month now, I've been meditating every day for an hour. I'm using HoloSync, binaural beats, and I find I don't believe in it. I've used it quite a lot at this point. I'm at the, I think the 6th of 12 stages to it. This is after a long period of kind of being out of the game. I was focused more on other things. Anyways, so I have a lot of experience with HoloSync, and I find that it deepens my practice, so I do use it most of the time. And I find that it helps me to stay regular in my practice, to keep doing it daily. When I'm using HoloSync, an hour of meditation is as difficult as a half hour would be normally. So meditating in silence is much more difficult for me to do. Now, I don't know if that's just because there's like rain sound effects or something, or maybe just that it functions as a timer and maybe it slightly entertains me. It has seemed very effective. The only reason I stopped for a long time is, well, this is part of it, is these fits, I guess you would say. So I want to describe exactly, what that feels like to me. I just want to give you my experience. And this isn't medical advice or anything like that. This is just swapping notes. Now, what I'm calling meditation psychosis, you could call it a panic attack. That's fine if you want. I think it's more correlated with spiritual behavior, yoga, meditation. I want to be really careful not to talk about a crazy amount about my personal life. That's not the point here. But I'm doing really well. I'm not in like a dark place. I'm not in any short supply of support or anything like that. So, just to contrast it, just to point out that this really seems to be provoked by the meditation practice itself. When I started doing it, it was very cosmic and very, there was a lot of ananda or bliss, that kind of almost opioid feeling to it, like getting a nice night of rest. And as I go, doing it every day, I feel like it sort of becomes a stressor on the body, and it becomes a little bit more difficult just to kind of keep my attention held, to stay present in the practice. I notice my body gets a little more whiny, and there's more like pains flaring up in my body. This is maybe the 4th time I've had this sensation that I can recognize, and it's slightly different each time. Today, it lasted literally only like 3 hours. Historically, it's lasted several days to I might even say a week. This is because I've kind of learned how to deal with it. And I'm going to talk a lot about that. I think that's probably the most important thing I can offer. Like I'm going to spend a little time trying to convince you of what this is, and more time, on the part of, okay, so what do I do? So meditation psychosis is not a real medical term. It's not a real condition. It's not a real thing. It's just a word that we use to describe whatever the heck happens when you meditate, and it causes, over time, you find that it does cause a sort of emotional upheaval, sort of like therapy. But honestly, the way I would describe it, I think that best describes it is like when you're tripping, when you're taking a psychedelic drug, like before it really kicks off, you have like a pretty profound feeling of like anxiety and like fear. I am a person who is particularly squeamish, I would say. Even I give blood quite a bit, and it scares the pants off of me. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. Like, I'm not scared in my mind. I understand that nothing can really go wrong, and I'm in good hands. It's not like that. It's my body. My body freaks out. It's not the needle. It's not the pokey. It doesn't hurt. It's nothing like that. It's just my body is scared that my blood is being exposed. I don't know. It's not rational is what I'm saying. I just have various phobias. I'm squeamish about blood. I'm squeamish about heights and some bugs. And I'm just kind of a scared dude. Like I'm willing to admit that. And last night I was talking with a friend quite at length about this, about my fear of just death and mortality. And that was actually a big part of why I began meditation practice in the first place, is that I had understood it to be like sort of a way to deal with and in therapy for those sorts of feelings. In the story of Gautama, the Buddha, his practice basically begins with him coming from a life of privilege and all of a sudden it dawning on him that all people must suffer and all people must die. I'm not so afraid of the death part, the annihilation, the unknown, the death of other people. I'm more focused on pain and fear.
I guess you could say that about most anything in life. It's not so bad as long as you can keep the fear from your mind.
I've been doing a lot of dream work as well lately. I'm not too deep into it. I've gone much deeper, but I am currently at the point where most of my dream sequences, there's about 4 or 5 throughout the night on a good night. I do wake up and I'll journal it down and I'll get maybe half of what happened as far as I can guess. Just because in the past I've gotten all of it, where it's like one night of dreams is like several full-length pages of a notebook. The only reason I'm bringing that up is I want to talk about that separately, but my dreams are very horror related. There's always like someone, recently there's been a lot of armed gunmen in my dreams and like terrorist kind of stuff. There was an alien invasion. There's a lot of murdery, like people trying to murder me. Just, monsters, aliens, ghosts, horror stuff, ghosts in haunted houses, and just Stephen King stuff. So it's cool though. It's, as you might know, like what makes a nightmare is not necessarily the content. Like I'm actually having fun and kind of self-aware that these are dreams, and oftentimes they're sort of like, Quentin Tarantino. It's fun to watch people shooting each other and torturing each other and stuff. If you have the right, if it's you, that's the attitude, So these are not terrible nightmares. They just are horror themed, and I'm kind of a spooky horror themed person is kind of what I'm saying. And so I think that might be part of why I'm so squeamish. And actually the first time I really experienced this, what I'm calling meditation psychosis, I was on a trip abroad, so I wasn't meditating. I was kind of in a hurry to do a bunch of stuff. And so after a long period of meditating every day for an hour, I'd gone about a whole month without meditating. And for whatever reason, and probably because of a lot of what I was putting into my body food-wise and exhaustion-wise, and bacteria and virus-wise, of course, too, when you're abroad, it did result in a pretty crazy episode of this. But in my mind, in my conscious mind, what it seemed like is I was reading this book called The American Book of the Dead, and I had become convinced just for the very first time in my life. I'm not a person who really believes in things. I'm not like a religious believer, superstitious, nothing really like that. But I'm open to these things. I'm like, whatever. If they're true, they're true. I don't find them to be very supported, and I feel like it's kind of easier to explain with human wish fulfillment and that sort of thing. I think there's a lot of better explanations for them than for superstitions to actually be real. But at this time, I had become somewhat convinced in the potential that like, wow, like reincarnation might actually be real. Like, not this guy, not this person that I am lives beyond death, but like that some aspect of this experiencing, witnessing creature that is at the core of me might live beyond death. And that to me is not a comfort in the slightest. I have no idea whether that's the way it is or not, but I don't think that it is currently, and I historically haven't. But for this time, I was sort of convinced that that is the case. And the idea of that is terrifying to me because I'm, to be honest, I'm from a pretty lucky, privileged background. I haven't had to deal with much terrible suffering or grief or loss or war or anything like that. And the idea that I will continuously be reborn into many lifetimes of just any random creature, that is terror to me. I don't want to be most of the people who have ever lived or most of the creatures. I don't want to live in most of the eras of time with their crazy out of control diseases that nobody knows what they are. I'm rather afraid of the time that we live in now, even though we live in a time of great comfort. We also live in a time of great fear, that at any time we could have a nuclear war or a crazy epidemic of a virus or a bacteria. And we just have so much awareness of the world that it's really easy to concoct really terrible scenarios, and some of them are rather realistic. So, and also, idle hands. We have a lot of leisure time, and we have a lot of curiosity, and horror and video games and books are really playing up that terror because it's fun. But that puts in your mind this sense that like suffering and death is like a very major, huge part of life, and the way that you deal with it is really important, which I do believe that. I am on board with that, and I'm just really worried that, if it ever comes down to an emergency or something where a friend is losing their mind, or in an accident or something terrible, or having a health problem, that I won't be able to perform reasonably in that situation, and that I would fail them, and that would increase their suffering, basically. That's a real fear of mine at this point. It's not always just about me. It's about everyone. It's just about the horrible responsibility that comes with being a human. So that's sort of the nature. That's what I'd say is like the nature of it. Mortal fear. It's fear just of this whole thing, this whole being on the earth, being myself, having the responsibility. There's no escape. I'm gonna die, and it's probably going to hurt, and it's probably going to be very scary and sad. And just that, I mean, I don't have to tell you about this because we're all there if we are. I think some people are naturally tougher, and I think that some people are, I think more often than not, though, we're just deluded about it. We're kind of lying to ourselves. We don't want to think about it right now. We're putting it on hold. So I think a big part of the meditative and spiritual practice and therapy is to really touch base with that and really let it out into the open. Now that's kind of the background. And so this is maybe like the fourth time that I've had this experience. And in the past, I did not know how to deal with it. I tried art, and that was kind of cool. I wrote some songs, wrote some poems and things like that. It didn't really help, but eventually it went away. What I did find, though, is when I get to feeling this way, I have to just meditate in silence. And it's the last thing on earth I want to do, because it seems like that's what's causing this fear. So I'm terrified to do it. But when I just go and sit on my cushion and just close my eyes, it's really easy to meditate. It just flows right in. And it's just what the doctor ordered. There's almost immediate relief, like within 10 minutes. And I think that the term panic attack is it's a catch-all term. It's a general term. It's not a specific thing. And honestly, from what I can tell in the literature, psychologically, it's more of a behavioral thing. It's a learned behavior that to recognize states of extreme anxiety as a panic attack. Now, I don't have a history of mental problems or emotional problems per se, any more than the next person. I've had issues with kind of depression and self-confidence, typical stuff for kind of the kind of person that I am, that you could probably tell just from like watching my channel. I've gone to therapists, and I've tried to check in, just to see, hey, am I okay? Do I seem okay? And they're always like, yeah, you seem actually really, really okay. And I've noticed one thing about people that do tend towards, bipolar or schizophrenia. They have it seems to me, a real inability to form kind of deep and lasting connections with people, and to trust people, and to let people in and have like actual intimacy with people. And that's not me at all. I always have like a best bud. I always have like a lot of people who really like me, and that a lot of people that I can run things by. I do a lot of reality testing. I'm always asking people, does this seem cool? Does this seem okay? Am I being reasonable? All that stuff I identify as being like pretty fundamental to being with it, to not having really like a major mental illness problem. But at times I would say the anxiety gets pretty intense, and I have gone to therapy, but at the same time, I've been through a lot of grief in my in my privileged life. Minor griefs. A person dies here or there. Suicide, or medical problems. I've had a lot of sort of what you'd call heartbreak, I guess, in relationships and friendships and professional stuff. Just I've had a lot of blows in my life, which I think most spiritual people would say that it just seems to come with the territory. It's like I'm not trying to claim a belief system, but it's like karma. When you want to have karma, you get karma. It's like when you want to play the game at a difficult level, a challenging level, it's something you can do. It's not horrible. It's not unmanageable, but it's just as much as you can stand. I think that's kind of when you're playing life on difficult, because you do still have that responsibility. You do still have that sense like, okay, this is me, this is my stuff, I got to get through this. And part of me getting through that has been my meditation practice. I see it as like almost like a responsibility to continue to meditate and explore what this is all about, the spiritual practice, the transcendence, the different states you get into. What are we really doing here? It's I think it's kind of one of the themes of my life. I think it's kind of one of the things that I have to contribute to the world, quite apart from what I actually do for a living. But that's kind of what I'm trying to do with this channel, is just bring attention and a sense of community to people who are doing practices that are making people feel this way, this really deep, icky stuff. Okay, if I stopped meditating now, I would probably use like nicotine. I don't know, I just kind of get more compulsive. It's kind of, for some reason, I can't really explain this, but when I am meditating, it's like that stuff doesn't seem necessary, and it doesn't seem like I have to use it in order to feel okay. But when I'm not meditating, it doesn't seem that way. It seems like I can't hold together without kind of medicating myself or soothing myself in like quite a few ways. So I don't like that about myself. And so I try to get back into meditation as much as I can. But, we all have like pretty complicated lives, and it's difficult to do that. So now I want to get into what like actually occurred. So again, I was up pretty late with my friend. We were talking about all this stuff in pretty good depth. It was a pretty intimate conversation. I really laid it out there, and there was a lot of back and forth about my fear of inadequacy and death and torture and reincarnation. All this stuff was kind of on the table, so it was on my mind. It was on my plate. I woke up that morning with a real sense of not being resolved, like a kind of angsty feeling. It was pretty intense, and you like your face itches and you're just kind of grumpy. And I sort of directed it at this friend, because like in the front of my mind, it seemed like sort of a conflict. And so I was like, okay, I contacted them. I was like, can we get together again? This is the same friend, right? And I'm like, can we get together again? I really want to talk about some stuff, like conflict stuff. I pose it like that. No big deal, but, I'm kind of feeling some sort of way, as they say in Michigan, and I wanted to deal with it, up front, because that's the kind of person I'm trying to be right now. I was finding myself, I was getting like unreasonably riled up. I think this is pretty characteristic, right? And so I'm like, okay, all right. I'm spazzing out here. And so I had a nice cup of tea, caffeine-free tea, not on anything at all. And I put on Bob's Burgers, like while I was doing some really mild work. So I'm just being really mellow, right? Bob's Burgers is like it's a really mellow, like family-friendly show, right? For me, at least, in terms of what I watch. And so that's supposed to soothe me as like, a happy place sort of thing. But it wasn't. It was really intense. So this is when I knew, I'm like, okay, I'm kind of messed up. Like watching this show, like just every little thing seems like sharp, like even just like the angles, like looking around this room, like the angles of things, the details of things were like sharp, like they kind of hurt, like wow, intense, noisy kind of, and wanting to retreat from it, like wow, when it was really hitting me, it's like you can feel in your head like this intensity, it's like I am crazy right now, I'm nuts, like my temples are like ringing, it's like you're being zapped or something. So, and also I try not to spaz out, don't panic is number one in the Hitchhiker's Guide. Just don't panic. So I'm just like, okay, take deep breaths, obviously we're having some sort of like panic episode here. And so I turn the TV off. I'm like, what should I do? And my first thought was I'll go and take a shower because I hadn't cleaned up yet for the day. So I went in there, and as I was doing that, I kind of noticed that I was still feeling really bizarre and kind of like lightheaded. And then I'm like, well, wait, am I having like a medical issue? Which I'm pretty sure I wasn't. I don't think so. And so I kind of just got through that. It was sort of rough, and I still felt pretty wound up, and everything was still kind of intense. And so I'm like, okay, this seems to be that sort of panic that I get when I meditate a lot. It's just in line with that. And so that was when I kind of started putting it together. Okay, this is that thing. I've had this several times before. It's not totally novel to me. So I had pieced together in the past like what really works. So I just sat on my cushion, no hollow sync, but just sitting on my cushion for a half hour, and then I checked in with myself. I did another half hour, and it was very easy. It was very peaceful. At that point, that sense of what I would call a sense of psychosis, that sense where you're like, oh my God, I'm freaking out right now, where like I'm tripping right now, I'm bugging out, that was kind of gone. I wasn't in like terror. And so that fixed that, and it was sort of a matter of time to get fully out of it. It was several more hours, but just at that point I was more under control. So I mean, number one tip is don't be afraid to meditate. Like literally even just laying in bed trying to sleep was ineffective. That was winding me up more, because like, I can't sleep, should I get up, should I not, is winding me up more. So specifically meditation, that's why I'm identifying this as a meditation thing. The meditation seems to be both the cause of it and the cure of it. Just push through.
I'm timed! I'm literally timed! Cosmic apotheosis wears off faster than salvia.
At this point, I'm getting pretty good at dealing with this when it comes up, and I don't have a guru or a teacher or anything. Like I don't even currently have a therapist, so pretty much on my own. I have to figure out, how to manage this, because I'm not going to stop with my meditation if I possibly can continue. I want to keep doing it an hour a day, which is for me is pretty intense and pretty demanding. Everybody's a little different. And so it's threefold, I would say, and I'm going to put it into Ken Wilber terms in modern times, is the waking up, the growing up, and the cleaning up. All three, they all come into play. So when we talk about the waking up, that's what I was describing, is go into the meditation, lean into it, let it terrify you, experience that state, just witness it, be present. You're just the cameraman, you're just there watching, and it's not hitting you. It's just something you're paying attention to, something that's happening in your body, in your heart, and in your mind. And that's number one, is the waking up part of it, because this is a waking up phenomenon. Number two, though, is growing up, and that is to do more with real, tangible lifestyle stuff. And obviously there are things that I could do to make myself more comfortable and less anxious. Definitely, that's true of everyone, and not coping mechanisms, but just that I'm in a state that's not entirely stable. Like even just being an adult and doing a YouTube channel just for my own leisure, just because it seems important to me in terms of my moral values to do a YouTube channel where I talk about philosophy and meditation. That's an expenditure, and meanwhile I'm not in the most awesome place in terms of my own financial situation or anything like that. So those things are developmental in nature. Those are things that you handle like an adult. I need to get better situated in my station in the world, and that's can lead to these sorts of feelings like that you don't have a security net for yourself or for the people you care about and things like that. That's part of it. So that's the growing up part of it. So waking up, growing up, and cleaning up. Now this is more traditional, what you would, if you went to a doctor, this is kind of where you'd go, is the shadow work. It's shadow work, right? So so I'm past the physiological part of it, and I'm in this really kind of serene, mellow place. But I do recognize that it's still on sort of the periphery of where I'm at right now, and it could come back if I'm not careful. So the cleaning up stuff, I brought it to the front. Obviously I'm not going to conquer my fear of like heights right now, but just some of the stuff that's nagging at me, I think this is important, along with meditating and kind of getting your life together. Get your life together, Jordan Peterson. Along with those things, those two, there's also just, what do I think is going on emotionally with me? What does it feel like in the front of my mind? And can I go deeper into that? So I talked to that friend, the same friend, and I really had to be honest and forthright about things I was really embarrassed about. I cried, and that's always hard for me as an adult man, just to cry in front of someone, to be like vulnerable in that way. And I think that a lot of shadow work is about that vulnerability and finding people that you can trust to be vulnerable with, that aren't going to throw acid in your face when you do that. Because I've had that experience too, and that's a large part of why it's so hard to be vulnerable, is like a lot of us have had bad friends or bad family members, just in the sense that they're not really capable of being supportive. So I knew that this person was someone I could trust, and so I did make myself vulnerable. It was very embarrassing. I did not want to do it. It was pretty intense for me. For this person, it didn't. It's like, what, really? That's it? That's but that's kind of the nature of shadow work, is you get things really coiled up and jacked up into a big thing, but it's not really a big deal. It's just like, I feel, hurt by this. I feel slighted by this. I feel inadequate. It gets really wound up, and it becomes this forbidden zone that you can never go to. And so your body's so accustomed to avoiding it and not paying attention to it, that you might not even be capable of it. You might have to dig.
Shovel your way out of the shit!
And I really think that's a large part of what we're doing in our meditation practice. A large part of it, not the whole thing, but just digging into our emotional space and relaxing these constraints that we place on our own perception of our emotional reality and our relationships with others, because we're held up on a scaffold of those sorts of things. In order to function, we can't just always feel everything going on in our heart and our body and our mind. You have to kind of select things. And I think when it becomes shadow is when you become either like overly fixated on something or overly resistant to something, to the point where it's just out of the question. It's all about going in relationship, or just with yourself, but also in relationship with someone who you trust, going to those places that are forbidden zones, that are terrifying, that you're like, oh, I don't want to show that to anyone. It's so pathetic. It's so ugly. That's the shadow work part of it. And so I tried to do all three of these. This is what I've learned, is that if I do all three of these, I actually got out of it really quick. And I don't know, maybe I'm not supposed to get out of it. Maybe I'm supposed to, maybe it's a good thing. It sure doesn't feel like it, but a lot of things are like that. Going to the dentist is scary, but they fix your teeth up. And I believe that it is in service of a greater project, the project of transcendence, transcending my human condition and frailty and all this, or at least just becoming more comfortable in my own skin and my own psyche. The solution, especially for me, but also what I'm recommending, not as medical advice, but just like a friend to a friend here, if you do have these Kundalini enlightenment experiences, these like really lesser waking states, but that get nightmarish, or they feel like a bad trip, you're going to a really dark place. This is normal. First of all, this is very normal. If you are really diligently doing a practice of some sort, that this is normal. These are things that occur. You have enormous emotional upheaval, and usually it comes out in little spurts, but sometimes it can be a pretty big spurt, and it can scare you away from doing that work. It's almost like kind of that's part of the function of it, is to scare you away from doing the work. There's a gatekeeper in your mind, a trickster that's trying to get you to feel like if you go into the deepest parts of yourself, it's going to be terrible and horrible and fearful. And that is partially true. There's a reason we hide things from ourselves. But it's also the feeling of reality, the feeling of being, the joy of life. You have both. It's the spice and the sugar, It's a fuller experience. It's a more present experience of life that we're seeking through transcendence. It's more reality. Reality contains bad and good. So again, like, you might be in a position like me where, like, okay, you're not, your family doesn't have the bubonic plague or whatever. You're relatively okay in the grand scope of things in the world and in history and everything. And so what right do you have to feel terror or feel angst or any of that? It's not about the position that you're in. We all have access to the awareness of those things. And you in your privileged position might have more of a capacity to really pay attention to those things, to really look into those things, to observe them more, and to even become sort of obsessed with them more. You might have that idle hands. You might have a lot of time, leisure time, to be exploring these things, and it can go to really dark places. So don't trivialize these things. Seek help first and foremost. Genuine professional therapy, long before the guy on the internet or whatever. If you're quite sure and you have checked that box, I'm not having I don't have schizophrenia. I've been to a professional, multiple professionals. I have a support structure. They're with me. But I'm having these intense emotional surges that become so overwhelming that I literally can't function. Like if this was a day that I had to work, I would have had to call in. Like I wouldn't trust myself to interact with people in the state that I was in. It was very intense. This has scared me off from the practice multiple times in the past. Like I go, oh my God, I don't want to feel like this. So I just quit meditating entirely. And then I get into like really intense coping stuff and coping mechanisms, and I become sort of a person that I don't want to be, a person with their head in the sand, And I think like, well, you've got to come to terms with these things, hopefully, in this lifetime, if you can. And if you can't, that's perfectly fine. Most people don't. It's fine. It's no big deal. It's just, I want to take on this challenge. I see it as a benevolent thing. I want to be capable of being present for whatever life has to offer, and I'm currently not. I need to get there. I need to work on it. That's how I see this. Like sometimes when you're a kid, maybe you like look up at the sky and you're like, what if gravity just reversed and I just fell? Like that's totally irrational, and you knew it then, you know it now, but like, what if? That would be really scary. And it's like your mind is just full of stuff like that. It's like your mind has this capacity to generate all sorts of horrible things that you usually keep suppressed. And so if through you're meditating, you're experimenting with your suppression mechanism. And just like if you take LSD or DMT, it's like that thing, however the chemical does this, it stops you from suppressing all that. And it's like, whoa, you're like blasted with infinity, which includes the most terrible thing you can imagine and the most amazing thing you can imagine. It's beautiful, it's intricate, it's complicated. It isn't just fear. If you're going to very seriously do Kundalini or Zen or any sort of meditation or real focusing awareness or mantra or any of that practice, I think you really should become familiar not just with the culture, with the tradition of it and what they claim this stuff is, but also with Western medicine and what is identified in the diagnostic criteria, what a psychosis is, what a manic episode is, because that's valuable data. You want to rule out or know if that is what's going on, because honestly, a lot of people who meditate do have these kind of comorbid psychological issues. It's pretty common for people who meditate to have major depression or bipolar or even schizophrenia. We're just all normal people with a variety of conditions, but I would even say it's kind of more common. And maybe this is because trauma will often bring people to a spiritual path, as I've kind of hinted at before. In my case, like I said, like it was sort of my own trauma that fully convinced me of the benefit, like, okay, I need to meditate because I don't know how I'm going to handle this. And indeed, like through meditation, I was better able to cope with things. I was better able to handle things. And so it did seem like it was an appropriate decision. We don't have diagnostic criteria for whatever the heck happens when you meditate for a long time, because like not enough people do it and not enough people consult with a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a doctor when these sorts of things happen, because they are interpreting, as I am, they're interpreting it through this traditional lens, that it's part of the practice, that it's working with the shadow as presented through meditation. And as always with the integral thing, I'm saying bring it all together, like use everything that we have at our disposal. Like fundamentally what I'm saying is, like, meditation is not going to cure an actual mental condition. It's not going to help with mental illness. It may even exacerbate a mental illness, because you have to cover those fundamental bases, that stuff that happens, in your first few years of life. Meditation is not going to cure borderline personality disorder. It's not going to heal you of trauma. It's a different thing. It's a whole different thing. It's a path of waking up. It's just becoming more aware. And if you have a lot of skeletons in your closet, if you have a lot of trauma that you haven't worked out, if you have a lot of fixations and obsessions, or you have a real rejection, an inability to face certain things, then I specifically don't recommend meditation. I recommend traditional therapy, possibly even to the point of medication, and those as like a training wheels, so that you can do that shadow work to get to a place, in terms of cleaning up and growing up, to get to a place where you're prepared to do the meditation, the waking up practice. Because if you don't do it that way, you're kind of endangering yourself, and you're endangering others. I'm walking a line here. I want to be really careful about what I say, both in terms of how I present myself and what sort of I'm giving as just like personal advice to the people who are having this experience, and probably just wanted to quickly hit the YouTube and see, does anyone else have this? Does this happen to other people when they meditate? Is this normal? I'm saying not everyone has it, but number one, just be aware that there's normal old clinical problems that psychotherapy, psychology, counseling, these things are meant to deal with that. Meditation is not meant to deal with that. Meditation is meant to wake you up to deeper truths, and it's a very challenging activity. If you're struggling with being out of control, you don't want to put more pressure on yourself. You don't want to take on a larger responsibility. It's the complete opposite of that. But if you're in a really comfortable place and you have just kind of a thirst for more of reality, you want to be more sensitive, you want to be more aware, you're ready to face things, that's what meditation is for. It's not a numbing agent. It's the total opposite. So I'm capable of talking to you about it, to share it. I wanted to do that. I was actually kind of jumped at the opportunity. I'm like, sweet, I'm like having that thing that I've always wanted to kind of talk about. I've always wanted to share with people, but I don't want to misrepresent it. So this is a really mild one. I've had it much worse. Mostly it's, again, I'm comparing it to like tripping, but like, each time that you have a trip, like on a drug, it becomes less profound, just because you're used to it. You're like, oh yeah, that thing, yeah, don't worry, it'll wear off. And that's definitely how I feel about like what I'm having today. It's like, okay, wow, this is intense, I'm really scared, but I've had this multiple times. It usually kind of bursts into like a plateau experience. Actually, it usually ends up being like a pretty wonderful feeling. So I'm kind of looking forward to that, but I might have more stuff to shovel up and work through before I can get there. I want to talk about every aspect of the meditation practice, the meditation experience. I want to talk about things that people aren't comfortable talking about. I kind of see that as my role here. I want to talk about the things that I want to be real with you, even though you're a stranger, because I find that really superficial people aren't really interested in my channel. I have a very small following, and they, from what I can tell, they all seem just amazing. I'm really happy. This is exactly what I wanted out of my channel. Just have a small following of people that are with me, on my level with me, and fellow psychonauts, people who are non-glibly, very seriously exploring what human potential is, what the mind can do. These are the people I want to proceed into the future with. This is my community. This is my Sangha. So the spirit within me acknowledges the spirit within you. Namaste.